Kailangan ngifake i-volume mfethu.
Hello everyone, my name is Keith Noble, and I want to welcome you to the first episode of Dr. Noble's Study. For those who do not know me, I have spent nearly the last 20 years working in and adjacent to the U.S. intelligence community. When I first started my career, I was an intelligence analyst in the Central Intelligence Agency, where I spent nearly a decade traveling the world working in more than 40 plus countries. In my last assignment, I was the chief of an open source intelligence facility in Tel Aviv, Israel. I've also spent a lot of time working in the private sector. I previously was an executive for Pinkerton Corporate Risk Management, where I served as a director for the state of Florida and Caribbean, and also had the privilege of traveling to Abu Dhabi, UAE, where I built one of the world's largest open source intelligence facilities. I started my own business and failed, which we'll talk about in future episodes. And most recently, I spent the last 2 years serving my country again as an executive in the U.S. State Department, where I had the pleasure and honor of serving as a director of the Office of Advanced Analytics in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. At present, I'm an executive with an international technology company, Pinlink, and I really have just spent a lot of time doing a lot of mentoring, doing a lot of traveling, and really just getting to know humanity. And in the cause and in the purpose of doing that, I've had the opportunity of meeting fascinating people from around the world. And one of the things that people have always asked me to do is to impart my nuggets, my words of wisdom. And so in line with that is really the reason why I decided to start my own podcast. You know, for those that are watching, especially here in the United States, this is a very difficult period. You know, we're in a period where we have an increase in the amount of stress and fear about what's happening, both here and abroad. We're in a place where we're afraid of our neighbors. You know, we are told that people who are different than us are somehow less than. And we're having a fundamental shift in our society and the cultural norms that underpin it. And in looking here in Virginia, where I currently live, and thinking about my children and thinking about the community, I think it's important to take a step back every now and then and start thinking about what can we do to make a difference? How can we uplift our neighbors? And so it's in line with that I decided to start a podcast where I intend to share experiences that I've had over the last 20 years in serving my country and being a senior executive, but more important that being a part of humanity. Yes, for those that continue to tune in every week as I bring out new episodes, we're going to talk about things that are positive, things that are dealing with self-help, that are dealing with what makes you a better person, a better father, a better mother. How can you go from being a student to being a professional? And so with this podcast, the idea is that you are coming to Dr. Noble's Study for insight, for food to nourish both your soul and your intellect. And so we're going to do an experiment where we're not going to give you a lot of empty calories. You're not going to see booty shaking. I'm not going to have a bunch of videos on here of things that are just cool to take your mind off of what's happening. The idea with Dr. Noble's Study is that we want to help develop society, to make us all a little better. And I've been privileged and have had the honor of being able to represent my country, of being able to work with some of the smartest people on the planet in challenging circumstances. So I want to take a lot of those lessons to impart the wisdom, and hopefully that you'll be able to take or share in some of the experiences I've had and help you make better decisions in your life, and also to help just think about ways that we as Americans, as citizens of humanity, what can we do to make a better impact on our community, on our friends, and our family for the benefit of all mankind. And so I want to thank you for coming with me on this journey. Now, for each episode, we're going to look at different topics that are things that I've experienced in both my personal life, my professional life. In future episodes, we're going to talk about what's it like to transition from going from the intelligence world into the business world. We'll talk about love, we'll talk about marriage, politics. We'll talk about all the things that are important to making you a healthy person who's contributing to society. But I thought it would be appropriate for our first episode that we would start with one of my core values that has been, that I inherited from my genetics and my family. And that has to do with mentorship. The power of mentorship. Now again, for most of the audience that is new to me and my background, I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio. I was born in Generation X, the greatest generation ever known. And I had the great opportunity of growing up in the early 1980s and 1990s, where we were just coming out of the 60s and 70s and everything was new. And we had gotten over integration. And I grew up in a time where I grew up around white kids, I grew up around black kids, I grew up around people that were impoverished and people that were very wealthy. So I had a great depth and breadth of an experience as a childhood that continues to help me here as a professional in the private sector. But when we think about mentorship, I want to share a brief story about someone that's near and dear to my heart. And that is my late grandfather, the Reverend Dr. Charles W. Noble, Sr. Now, I'm sure all of you, has or had wonderful grandparents. And I got to say, coming of age in the mid to late 1990s, I couldn't have asked for a better mentor. My grandpa was everything to me. He was a lion in our family. He was the senior pastor at Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, where he served honorably for more than 42 years. He was an executive in a National Baptist Convention and was one of the first pastors in the Nixon administration who worked with HUD to be able to get funding for churches to build low-income housing for the parishioners in their communities. At the time of his retirement, the National Baptist Convention had more than $400 million worth of real estate around the country where people, regardless of race, color, ethnicity, were able to have decency and respect by living in affordable, safe housing. And so that was my primary mentor as I was coming to age, my grandfather. Now, my grandfather, being a third-generation Baptist pastor, every time I came to my grandfather's study, and yes, that is the inspiration for the title of this channel, I knew I was going to sit down, I was going to listen, and he was going to give me some nuggets that I knew were going to help me make better decisions. And so when we think about this podcast, especially with today's topic, mentoring, I take to heart what it was like when I was in my early 20s and I would go to Newark, Ohio, the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, to sit and be mentored by the greatest human being, in my opinion, that had ever walked the planet. And my grandfather had said something to me that I'm going to share with you that I think is very apropos to what's happening in our society today, and is a principle that I can tell you now 20 plus years later that my grandfather was right. He once told me that service is the highest form of living. Service. He encouraged me to serve my community because it was in that service that you were better positioned to support your God, to support your community, and your country. And my grandfather was not someone who just spoke at the pew and everyone listened. He was someone that he would always get his hands dirty. And he told me the story And again, my grandfather in the 1970s and the 1980s was a major figure in the National Baptist scene. And he told me the story that a man who had been in prison had came to his pastor's study, and he was not there, and the secretary at the time told him to wait. Pastor will be here. And I can't remember what my grandfather was doing, but by the time that he came to the study, this young man who had just got out of prison had left. Some time went on, and my grandfather had found the young man and asked him, "Why didn't you wait in my study?" And the man said that he looked on my grandfather's wall and saw all of his awards, all of his honors, and felt that he did not belong in the same room with my grandfather. So he left. Now, for those that are watching that knew Reverend Noble, you can only imagine what he did next. My grandfather proceeded to take down every award, every honor or distinction in his office. He took it down because he didn't want anything to become between him and the service to his flock, to his community, as a representative of Jesus Christ. And that really resonated with me, this idea of service. And so, being who I was, I immediately went out and got involved with a lot of organizations and felt like, hey, it was good for my grandfather, it was going to be good for me. And I got frustrated because the more effort, the more energy and passion that I put into my service, I found that people didn't appreciate it. I got criticized a lot. And people were constantly just having issues with the fact that I was being overzealous in wanting to lead. Because again, my model was my grandfather. And I'll never forget, he sat me down and he told me, he said, "Son, this is a principle in life that I want you to remember." He said, "You cannot establish yourself. Someone established has to establish you." I'm going to repeat that again. You cannot establish yourself. Someone established has to establish you. Little did I know that evening, when my grandfather gave me that advice all those years ago, that it would fundamentally change my life. Again, 20 plus years working in the highest levels of the U.S. intelligence community and in corporate America. I have hired hundreds of individuals, sat in hundreds of interviews, managed tens of millions of dollars in initiatives that span the entire spectrum. And the one thing that I will tell you that the government, the private sector constantly fail is the idea of how do we mentor junior staff? How do you develop the future leaders of your organization? I imagine, because I'm also, in addition to being an executive at Penlink, I'm also an adjunct professor at George Washington University. So I imagine a lot of my students will be watching this podcast at some point. And all of them are very zealous in wanting to get into government affairs, international relations. And like me, when I was in my early 20s, that zeal, that need to give back. We often miss the principle of being nurtured and being developed. My father once told me to enjoy the process when I was going to graduate school. Because I wanted, my first day of graduate school, I wanted to, how fast can I get out of here and get started? But it's a process, a seasoning that takes place. And in organizations around the world, this is often overlooked. I imagine for you who are listening and you're working in an organization, there's no formal mentoring program. You're just lucky if you know that one senior executive or senior staff assistant who takes the time to kind of show you the ropes. But my grandfather and going back to him and going back to his study in Newark, Ohio, he was right. You cannot establish yourself. Someone established has to establish you. I want everyone that's listening right now, take a moment and think back to when you were a young man or woman. Maybe you were playing baseball. Maybe you were playing hockey. And think about the impact that your coach made on you. Think about those tough times when you were just learning how to win, how to handle defeat. You know, we live in a society where if you don't have instant gratification, people give up, walk away, that's it. We wonder why we have problems today. Young men and women at every phase in life, both personally and professionally, require mentorship. It's one of the things that when we came down from the trees of Africa, that's helped us for millions of years to evolve and develop. The idea of passing knowledge, passing wisdom from one generation to another. Think about your community. Think about a pastor that you may have had, or an imam, or a rabbi who played a major role in your development. Or think about if you were like me growing up, a single parent mom, and everyone's parent had to give me a ride to football practice. You know how hard it is sharing someone's dad, someone's mother when you're 15 years old. I think about all of those men and women that imparted life lessons on me. I was being developed. You know, there's an African proverb, it takes a community or a village to raise a child. But somehow, we put all these efforts in getting young people into school, getting them developed, getting them off the streets, getting them focused. And then when they graduate and they enter the corporate world, somehow we turn off the idea that they still require mentorship. When I first started at CIA, he wasn't my immediate supervisor, but he was the head of my unit that I was involved with. His name was Cyril, and he went on to become a very senior. In fact, he became the most senior person in the intelligence community for Africa. And Cyril saw me, young African-American new analyst, and I was intimidated. You know, here I was, I just got my PhD, went to Miami University, you see it in the back, and I'm literally at the central, the most sacred place in the world, and I'm next to some of the brightest human beings I've ever met. My first assignment, I was a part of a team that was responsible for developing analytic models to measure the likelihood of nation states entering some form of instability or backtracking from democracy. And I was intimidated. In fact, my first week, I almost quit. I didn't think that I belonged. And yet Cyril, who was the head of my group, it was called the Societal Instability Group, saw something in me, and he invested time in me to help me grow and mature. I could go to Cyril and ask questions and not be afraid of being exposed or somehow that I was going to be less than my colleagues who had been in the organization longer, or some of my colleagues were second and third generation CIA officers. But Cyril took the time to invest in me, to help me develop so that I could grow and blossom. And throughout my tenure in the Central Intelligence Agency, men and women took the time to help build me into a quality, effective executive so that I, in turn, can pass those values, those best practices forward. And in doing so, and in thinking now, 20 years later, all of the mentees that I've had the privilege of helping to develop and participating in their success, in their life journey, whether they be at the State Department, whether they be in the U.S. military. I've had an amazing opportunity to impact society by taking time to invest in others who were not related to me, many of whom do not look like me, do not share the same ethnic background, cultural identity. But thinking about my grandfather, the late Reverend Dr. Charles W. Noble Sr., service. There's nothing more important than service. And I want you to think about that in the audience. I want you to think, if you are in a position of leadership, and this is another key point. You know, oftentimes we think that to be a leader, you have to have a position. You have to be a vice president, or you have to be a team lead, or you have to be a manager. Martin Luther King Jr., the late, great American civil rights enthusiast, said, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. Everyone who's listening to this initial podcast has an opportunity to lead and to mentor. You don't have to be a gray beard or 20, 30 years in the game, as the young people say, in order to make a difference in the next generation of staff employee or player or fill in the blank, whatever it is. Think about this. How effective, what are the efficiencies that could be gained in your organization if you developed a formal mentoring program? For those that are in senior executive positions, think about the men and women who help put you where you are. And for a lot of my students who may be listening, or the young persons in the audience, one of the questions that I often get is, how do I go about asking someone to be a mentor? You know, we put so much pressure on more seasoned folks to reach out, but you know, it's not a natural thing going up to someone and say, hey, will you mentor me? Or for someone more senior, you know, I'm going to bring you in my wing. So I will give you a personal life example to make this point. So, as I mentioned previously, I had the privilege of attending Miami University, where I got a PhD in international relations and comparative politics. Now, for those in the audience who knew me in undergrad, I was probably the least likely to get an advanced degree in anything. I went to the Ohio State University. I spent 3 years at Ohio State, and I was a quarter away from graduating with a GPA that was, let's just say, lower than 2.0. I had joined a fraternity my first year in school at Capital University. I was in ROTC. I was playing football, and I was doing anything and everything other than studying. You know, I mentioned about a year ago at a commencement speech at George Mason University, my biggest fear in life was that I was going to finish school and I was going to enter the family business, and that's working at the post office. You know, my mother spent nearly 30 years at the post office. My Uncle Skip, who's listening, I imagine he spent over 50 years in the post office. My mother's father worked at the post office. My mother's mother, my grandmother, worked at the post office. My great aunt worked at the post office. Hell, my brother worked at the post office. That was like the thing in Columbus, Ohio. In the post office, God bless you, you helped raise me. I will never, ever, ever, ever regret all the things that the post office did for my family. But that was not what I wanted for me. I wanted to see the world and wanted to make a difference. Yet, the younger version of Dr. Noble, I wasn't about those books. I was enjoying a good life. And so, a quarter before I graduated, I made a fateful decision that I needed to transfer away from Ohio State. And I went back to the first school that I started, Capital University, a small school in Bexley, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. And I spent the next year and a half studying. I blocked everything out. I got near straight A's. And so when I graduated and I applied to graduate school, I was denied. I applied to 3 schools. I won't mention the name of those schools, but they all rejected me. And I was devastated. I had the makeup, the stuff to get through graduate school, but I didn't have the bona fides. My grades still, I had to increase my GPA. That's why I had to spend an extra year and a half in school. And because I had partied so much, I really wasn't in the books and the journals, and my writing was subpar. So I spent a year being a substitute teacher in Columbus Public Schools. And it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Getting a chance to work with children that were not as privileged as I was, getting a chance to serve, getting a chance to mentor. I taught everything from pre-K all the way up to 12th grade. I coached girls track. It was an amazing year of my life. And we'll talk about on another podcast about the importance of serving in the community and what you can do with that. Well, that'll be another podcast. So a year goes by, I apply to graduate school and I get accepted and I attend Miami University. But it was very clear when I started my graduate work that I was behind my colleagues. I wasn't writing academic journals as a senior and junior, and I didn't go abroad to study. I was, really graduating from the School of Hard Knocks in order to get to grad school. So I'll never forget this. My first day, when all the students come in and you go through an induct with your department, I met the head of the graduate department for international relations. His name was Dr. John Rothgibb. And I basically told Dr. Rothgibb that I was going to need some help. And over the next 4 years, Dr. Rothgibb went out of his way to get me the help and support that I needed so that I could graduate with honors with a PhD from Miami University. And that was a long way of saying that I just made myself available. I came to Dr. Rothgibb and I said, will you help me? And so for the young people that are listening to this podcast, if you don't step up for anything in life, the answer is always no. So how do you go about finding a mentor? Just ask someone. Hey, Dr. such and such, or hey, Professor fill in the blank. I've been, I'm in your class, or, you just started a job and you may speak to your supervisor or your supervisor and say, hey, every now and then, would it be okay if I just ask you some questions? I'd really like to get your perspective. One of the things with the people that I mentor, I often tell them to get this amazing book called The 48 Laws of Power. That will be another podcast. And in that book, it talks about how power operates, how humanity works. And one of the fundamental principles about human beings is that when someone does a favor for you, it's something that's wired into our DNA. They are now vested in your future. And so for everyone who's listening that is ever wondered, how do you go about getting a mentor? Find someone that is in your chain of command, so to speak, someone that is a part of your formal leadership. Could be your immediate supervisor. Find someone that is within your organization that you identify with, that you aspire to be. And then find someone that has nothing to do with your organization and your company. You should try to have a minimum of 3 human beings that you can go to at a moment's notice and get advice. Because remember what my grandfather said, you cannot establish yourself. Someone established has to establish you. And that's something that you can take with you the rest of your life. Never be afraid to seek wisdom. to seek knowledge. And you'll be surprised how willing people that do have that wisdom and knowledge, those that have been established, they're happy to impart wisdom. They're happy to share what helped them get to where they are. See, until you've been in that boardroom or have had to hire human beings, you don't know what you're missing. A mentor can help you avoid mistakes that will be detrimental to your career. A mentor can give you advice that will help you grow both in your professional career and your personal life. You know, a good mentor will always tell you the truth. And a good mentee is someone who is willing to listen to it. And sometimes a mentor will give advice that's tough. You know, with some of my mentees, they haven't always liked what I had to tell them because sometimes it's pointed. And for some of you out there, you need to get shaken out of your current predicament. You know, a lot of times people feel like there's an easy way to success. There's a fast track to making $1 million. Yeah, you can play a scratch off. Probably not likely to win. There is no substitute for hard work and effort. And someone who has mentored a lot of human beings all over the world, there's nothing more rewarding than seeing someone who wants to take your bit of wisdom and knowledge and add it to theirs, and then they advance themselves. They take the time to listen. They take the time to process what you're trying to share with them, what you're trying to show, what you're trying to do for them. And so for this first episode, I thought it was really important to start off with something that was near and dear to my heart, and that's mentorship. For mentees, do not take your mentors for granted. Professionals, the most precious thing that we have that you can never get back, it's worth more than money, and that's time. And you find another human being that's willing to invest time into you, cherish it. My grandfather benefited hundreds of human beings that took advantage of his life lessons, irregardless if they were his blood or not. One of the things, as we think about what can make our world a better place, you know, what can I do to impact my community? Especially in a time when we are afraid and many of us feel helpless. Many of us feel that, you know, we've lost the vision of the country and our finances and what's happening politically and internationally. We could talk about a lot of those things. But I'll tell you, a place where you can start is by finding a young person and being a part of their life. If you have time, get involved with big brothers and big sisters. They're all over the country. Get involved in social organizations or fraternal organizations. I myself am a life member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. I'm also a past master in Prince Hall Freemasonry. I love being involved in organizations because it's an outlet for me for public service. You know, there's nothing like helping an organization with developing a business plan or speaking to young men and women, or in some circumstances, cutting the grass. Whatever is required, show up. But in particularly for those of us that get a little more gray hair and have a little more life experience, find a way to give back to your community. You know, we complain about the state of our politics. We complain about what's happening. But ask yourselves, what are we doing to be the solution that we want to see? Don't look to a politician to be the leader. Be it yourself. Again, Dr. King, everyone can be great because everyone can serve. And so I want to thank everyone for listening in on our initial podcast. I intend to post twice a week, so please look out. I'm going to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the page. I look forward to your comments, and I look forward to the opportunity of sharing, again, more of my life experiences, my observations about what's happening in the world. And I'm just going to encourage you, like my grandfather said, service is the highest form of living. Find something, find someone that you can serve, be the difference in your community, and think about developing the next generation. I want to thank everyone. God bless, and I look forward to seeing you the next time here on Dr. Noble's Study. All the best.
Kailangan sa volume,